Hello, and welcome to a Rodent's Guide on the Ork Kommandos in Kill Team 2024. This video will serve as both a general introduction and a specialist introduction to those that have played the Ork Kommandos before. There will be timestamps in the description below to help you navigate this video. The Ork Kommandos were mostly an 11 model team in KT21, and they remain that way in KT24. In most matchups, the team will consist of one regular commando boy and all available specialists except for the Burna boy, which often gets swapped for a second regular boy. The Burna did get some adjustments in KT24, moving from 5 attacks hitting on 2s with 2-2 damage, now to 4 attacks hitting on 2s with 3-3 damage, which means that there are some instances where you might consider taking him, but most of the time you end up just taking a second regular boy. Some other operatives have seen some tweaks in their data cards, so let's go ahead and take a look at each of the operatives. The Knob Leader now has 1 additional wound, up to 14 now in KT24, but the Big Choppa now hits on 3s instead of 2s. This means that both weapons are 4 attacks hitting on 3s with 5 damage on normal hits. The choice for the player now is if you'd like the Punishing keyword and a 6 damage critical, or the Brutal keyword and a 7 damage crit. This matters a bit depending on the opponent across the table, but I feel like the Power Claw can be taken in more scenarios than it was in KT21. Against models with 14 plus wounds, however, you still probably want to take the Big Choppa. Finally, the Knob itself is 3 APL by default, but using their APL buffing ability now costs an action. This is just a strict upgrade over the previous ability, since now we can assign the APL to another operative in the middle of our activation, giving us increased flexibility. The Daka Boy is largely the same operative in KT24 that it was in KT21, but the short-range shooting profile got dialed back a little bit. We lose Relentless and instead we have the new Ceaseless version, which is a painful change since we're only hitting on 4s. The Daka Boy retains the Daka Dash ability, which really keeps the movement options open to this 2 APL operative. Just don't expect to be punching through as much damage with this as you were in KT21. The Sniper Boy gets a handful of changes moving into KT24. The Scoped Big Shooter went from 6 attacks hitting on 3s with 2-2 Mortal Wounds 2, now to 5 attacks hitting on 3s with 3-3 Devastating 2. The change is minor, but ultimately means that the Sniper will be doing more damage on average to operatives with worse defensive saves. The math is nearly equal against operatives with a 3-up save in shooting. The real downgrade here comes from the loss of the Best Spot as an ability, meaning that the Sniper Boy can only shoot from conceal once per game. This is a general trend in KT24, but it hurts that we lose a permanent silent option. Also, the multi-target ability is now a standalone shooting profile, but it loses the Dev2 keyword. If you don't need to do a large amount of damage to a single target, the Torrent profile will average more damage on the enemy team if you can hit 2 or more targets with those shots. The Rocket Boy is the most changed operative for the Kommandos going into KT24. The Rocket Launcher now has 2 profiles, which functions the same as the KT21 version with and without the old Boom Boy ability active. The actual keywords on the weapon, however, are significantly altered. We lose AP1, Splash 1, and the chance to have Relentless in exchange for 1 additional attack die, Blast of 1 inch, Heavy, and the chance to have Ceaseless. This change means more damage when dashing than previously, but less damage when standing still or when moving. This, of course, changes drastically if you're able to land a shot where the Blast 1 inch ability hits multiple targets, which massively improves the damage output of this operative. They still pack quite the punch, but they are no longer that elite killing operative that they were in KT21. The Burna Boy got a similar treatment as the Sniper Boy, losing 1 attack but gaining +1/+1 on their damage profile. Now with 4 attacks hitting on 2s and 3-3 damage, the Burna Boy does slightly more damage to targets with worse armor saves. The Burna Boy also gets a new shooting profile called Deluge, which is able to hit enemies on conceal, but the range is only 4 inches and you lose the Torrent keyword. This operative is still difficult to justify and is likely only worth considering into horde teams where you can get 2 to 3 enemies grouped up reliably, or against teams with 9 or fewer wounds on their operatives because of those breakpoints. The Slasher Boy is mostly unchanged in KT24. The throwing knives are unchanged and the twin choppas lose Relentless for the new Ceaseless keyword and gain Lethal 5 up. This is a minor upgrade mathematically, with more crits having a better impact than rerolling 2s. There are some niche scenarios where you're able to fish for crits less by rerolling everything with Relentless, but the lethal 5-up should help smooth that out anyway. Also, the Dat All You Got ability gets a minor change from dealing a flat 2 damage to enemies that survive the combat, now to dealing 1d3. Most of the time, this is either the same or just mathematically better. The Breacher Boy is the first operative other than the leader to get a straight up upgrade on this list. The Breacher Ram weapon went from 3 attacks hitting on 3s to 4 attacks hitting on 4s, which increases the viability of this weapon respectably. It's now also always under the benefit of the shock keyword, instead of just when the Breacher Boy had performed a charge. In a nice flavor update, the Breacher Boy also now has access to the Breach action, which functions as it did before when moving through terrain, except that it can leave a breach token behind to allow other operatives to follow after it. This utility will definitely impact strategic planning and can catch opponents off guard if they don't know it's coming. The standard boy has the exact same stats, but now has the tactical whatnots ability in KT-24. This new ability gives friendly commando boys the ability to throw a smoke or stun grenade in addition to those available from equipment selections. Only one smoke or stun can be used each turning point in this way, but it adds some useful flexibility to even more of a reason to take a standard boy. The Comms Boy is also nearly the same in KT-24. The critical damage on the Shaka pistol is reduced by 1, but gains the severe rule, which means that we will always be getting at least 1 crit if we hit anything at all. This is a minor upgrade, but it makes it easier to chip damage with the Comms Boy if that ever becomes relevant. All of the utility from the Comms Boy remains the same as it was in KT-21, with being able to perform a mission action or pickup action for 1 less AP each turning point, and that it can spend an AP to grant an allied operative plus 1 APL. A great support model that pulls extra weight on particular missions. This guy is an auto take. The Bomb Squig sees mostly nerfs to their datasheet in KT-24. They go from 6 wounds down to 5, but now save on 5s instead of 6s. Mostly, their Dynamite loses its ability to punch through armor with a loss of AP1/P2, instead going up to 6 attack dice, hitting on 4s for 4 or 5 damage overall. Overall, this results in less damage in nearly all cases, but the weapon does target the squig itself when you use the Detonate ability, meaning that sometimes the squig will actually survive its own explosion. The Grot is exactly the same as it was in KT-21. Not too much to say here, but this operative is highly useful and nearly an auto take in every game. It can threaten objectives all across the board and swing control of objectives in ways that your opponent might not anticipate if they lose track of them. Let's now take a moment to look at some of the strategic and firefight ploys available to the Ork Kommandos. Daka 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 remains the same in KT-24 as it was in KT-21. When shooting, if you retain any crits, you can convert a failed hit into a normal hit. This is a win more type of ploy, but can really bring some firepower into the fight. Skulk About remains the same in KT-24 as well. If an operative has a conceal order, you can retain a defense die in addition to cover if it applies. This can be useful for keeping operatives from being shot off the board, but generally speaking, you should be positioning so that you aren't being shot in the first place. This ploy usually doesn't help enough against teams with good quality shooting. Shush effectively is the same as it was in KT-21, but now it cannot be used in the first turning point. This is a great surprise tactic that can adjust critical threat ranges or position operatives for a punishing opener to the next turning point. Important to note, though, that this ploy is used after initiative is determined for the turning point. Meaning that if you know that you're going to be going first, you can dash out key operatives into charge range or peek someone like the Rocket Boy out to get a powerful volley off while still under the aimed profile, and then dash them back to safety. Wah gets a downgrade here, now only giving the balance keyword to commando operatives in melee. It still helps to get that single crit that can often seal a combat, but it's much less reliable than it was, so be careful when trying to count on that one critical hit if that's what you need. Just a Scratch remains the same linchpin ploy that everyone loved or hated in KT-21. This is the post-nerf ability that was present at the end of KT-21, meaning that it can only be used to nullify a normal hit against an operative, but this is still a very powerful tool, and it can easily break open a combat or shooting action and mess up your opponent's plans when used correctly. Crump 'em is the exact same ploy. At the end of the firefight phase, Select the friendly operative to perform the fight action. It can be a great way to get an unexpected fight off and swing control of objective before the end of the turning point. Also, don't forget that buffs that last through the end of the turning point, like Wah, will still be in effect here too. Sneaky Git is no longer a tool in the Kommandos toolkit, which hampers early aggression and board presence heavily. Kommandos now have to move up the board and fight for objective control honestly. We do, however, trade Sneaky Git for two other tactical ploys: Cunning but Brutal and Shake It Off. Cunning but Brutal says that if you charge from Conceal and you strike with a normal hit, you can treat it as a critical instead. Niche, but it might help you achieve an important breakpoint when relevant. Also note that it doesn't specify you can't follow it up with other critical strikes, so it is a way to cheat multiple criticals through if you didn't roll more than one organically. Shake It Off is another niche ploy that allows you to pay a CP to ignore APL modifiers for one operative. There will be scenarios where this is important, but it isn't something that's going to come up all the time. So let's talk some strengths and weaknesses for the Ork Kommandos in the new edition. The Ork Kommandos now play very differently than they did before in KT21. Before, they could bully their opponent before the game even started by forward deploying and starting the pressure early. Now, without those forward deployment options and not being able to use Shush in turn 1, the Kommandos are forced to play a much more honest game. Their shooting has also seen some significant adjustments, specifically losing their armor-piercing options, which means that their shooting is far less consistent than it was in KT21. They do roll lots of dice, however, which feels pretty orky, but you have to take the good with the bad when you value the weight of the shooting. Despite the introduction of the kill op for scoring victory points, the Kommandos really don't kill their opponent as well as they used to in KT21. Because the Kommandos don't have a very powerful defensive option, players may find it difficult to keep their operatives on the table, often then trading back and forth. The Kommandos team is almost always 11 activations, which means they activate elite teams and other mid-range teams, but the counteract option is a more powerful option than Overwatch was in KT21, and having more activations gives increased flexibility, which is an advantage of its own. In general, Kommandos players will find greater success if they can patiently wait out the key activations of elite opponents, and if they can force positive trades against mid-range or horde teams. Alright, let's look at some tips and tricks for success with the Kommandos. As mentioned earlier, the Shush strategic ploy is declared after the initiative order is known for a turning point, which means that you can use it to peek out key operatives like the Rocket Boy and get stationary shots at the beginning of the turn, and it can also nudge operatives into charge range for those that were staged outside of a return charge in case you didn't win that initiative. Another tip is to make sure to use Daka 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 in turns where you plan to shoot with the Bomb Squig, Rocket Boy, Sniper Boy, Daka Boy, and or multiple crack grenades or the dynamite equipment. This ploy does best when it's applied to the greatest volume of fire, so the more shooting actions you can get, the better the benefit. Just to Scratch is a super important tool, so saving it until critical moments will make or break the Kommandos gameplay. It can be used to swing important combats, keep a key operative alive or above the injured threshold, and to force your opponent to spend additional actions dealing with an operative that should have been killed. This can inadvertently also protect other key operatives as well. TAC ops are now more important in KT24 than they were in KT21, and the Kommandos have a special interaction with the Surveillance TAC op. This secondary plays perfectly with the Commando Grot, especially on boards with Vulcus terrain. The trick is to use the grappling hook into protected locations on Vantage and spy on enemy operatives using the Grot's super conceal and high mobility. The Grot can reasonably score 5 points from this all by itself, sometimes 6 if they aren't pressured out of their spot. If you suspect that you can still keep the Grot alive, like against elites or teams or missions where pushing up the board is really important, choosing the TAC op to be your primary objective will often net you another 3 victory points. In many games, this means that over half of your team's points can come just from the Grot operative itself. Okay, let's talk about some pitfalls or shortcomings of the Kommandos in the new edition. If you played the Kommandos in KT21, you might be tempted to have your primary objective as the kill op. this team will struggle to kill proportionally more operatives than your opponent, and it's often at odds with the strategy needed to execute on the surveillance tac op and the crit op for the game. I think the kill op is commonly the lowest scoring aspect of the Kommandos game plan, so don't get carried away and forget the other aspects of this game. Kommandos shooting is not as underrated as it was in KT21. You should definitely be taking shots, and lots of them when possible, but don't count on it. It becomes a nice to have sort of tool in the toolbox, but try to build a game plan around more reliable melee combat strengths of the team and consistent scoring from the tac ops. Although I just mentioned that melee combat is more reliable than the shooting for the team, the Kommandos don't have that many solid melee operatives. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of the team could be classified as melee specialists, but they often will have trouble with the melee specialists from other teams unless you're using things like just a scratch to tip the scales. Don't just run your melee specialists into combat without a specific goal in mind, since they often still take enough damage to make further fights difficult. Overall, the Ork Kommandos are a team that can fit with players at all skill levels, and I highly recommend taking this team for a spin to expand your perspectives as a player. They are a team that thrives in the hands of a strategic thinker, but some players will be frustrated if they try to play the team as an aggressive, rush-down force. This team has some of the best specialists in the game and beautiful models, making it an appealing choice for many people. It's also incredibly flexible, being able to lean into a variety of strengths depending on what the matchup calls for, so players who commit to practicing this team will enjoy the complexity of strategy that's available, and it also makes a great team to learn basic usage for specialist operatives. If you've made it this far in the video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment if you are a Kommandos enjoyer, or if there's another team that you would like for us to cover in a similar deep dive. Looking forward to seeing you guys next time, and I hope to get more videos on the channel soon. Have fun, and be good if you want to.